The basis of cow cognition, an examination of Dignāga's Apoha theory. K. Kataoka. This paper investigates the fundamental question of how the cognition of cow is established within Dignāga's Apoha theory. The core tenet of Apoha theory posits that the term cow enables the general understanding of all cows by excluding what is not a cow. However, a crucial question arises: how is that which is to be excluded as non-cow itself understood? The problem revisited. Hattori, 1977, suggests that non-cows, such as horses, are excluded on the basis of lacking dewlap, sasna, etc. 1. This implies that the absence of such features serves as the basis for understanding non-cow. Similarly, Akamatsu, 1980, echoes this view. However, Tanazawa, 1998, critically observes that this line of reasoning inadvertently acknowledges positive existence, such as dewlap, from the outset, too. That is, stating it is not a cow because it lacks dewlap, etc. implicitly presumes an understanding that a cow is something possessing dewlap, etc. This approach effectively grants dewlap as a necessary and sufficient definitional characteristic for a cow. Ultimately, this seems to replace the acceptance of the universal cowness with a definitional characteristic like dewlap. Tanazawa's implied question is whether this undermines the very essence of Apoha theory. How, then, did Dignāga himself, the founder of Apoha theory, conceive of this? While the intricate philological issues surrounding the interpretation of Pramasamukya, v41, Ps v41, will be addressed elsewhere, this paper aims to elucidate two conflicting perspectives, highlighting their philosophical implications and inherent incompatibility. Furthermore, it seeks to trace the emergence of the problem identified by Tanazawa back to Dignāga's own time and to demonstrate that it was a point of contention in his debate with the Skaya scholar Madhava, as documented in Ps v41. This will underscore the accuracy of Tanazawa's intuition in relation to Dignāga's understanding. Two opposing views. The notion that a cow is understood through the presence of features like dewlap, sasna, etc., is already presupposed as common knowledge at the beginning of the Mabya. 3. Therefore, the idea that the cognition "this is a cow" is based on observing dewlap is widely accepted within Indian philosophy, and indeed, can be considered a commonplace understanding in the everyday world. Cognition of cow observing dewlap, etc. Extending this idea, the very essence of a cow can be said to lie in its dewlap, etc. In other words, the essence of a cow is dewlap, etc. Carried to its logical conclusion, recognizing dewlap, etc., as a definitional characteristic implies that a cow is nothing other than dewlap, etc., or a cow is nothing other than a collection of dewlap, etc. Cow equals dewlap, etc., or a collection thereof. This position, as evident from the Pramasamukya, Ps, appears in Ps as the view of the Skaya school's Madhava. Standing in opposition to this is the Apoha theory's stance. 4. Ps at v41, it has thus been stated, just as, for you, Skaya, the cognition of a cow, Gapratyaya, arises from the observation of a collection of dewlap, sasnadasamaha, etc., so too, for me, Dignāga, the understanding of an entity, Atmantar Pratyaya, arises from the observation of the non-existence of other entities, Atmantrabhavadarsanat. This means that the cognition of an entity is based on observing the non-existence of other entities. Specifically, the understanding of cow is based on observing the non-existence of non-cow. In other words, the cognition of cow is based on the exclusion of non-cow. This is the fundamental tenet of Apoha theory. Understanding of an entity observing the non-existence of other entities. Cognition of cow, exclusion of non-cow. This is the core tenet of Apoha theory. The general understanding of cow is underpinned by the cognition it is not a non-cow. Ultimately, the essence of a cow is nothing but the non-existence of non-cow. The affirmation cow is not inherent but rather has its essence in the negation not a non-cow. An entity equals non-existence of other entities. Cow equals non-existence of non-cow. As is evident thus far, if the understanding of cow is based on the exclusion of non-cow, which is the foundational principle of Apoha theory, then the understanding of cow based on observing dewlap is contrary to Apoha theory. In other words, within Apoha theory, since cow equals non-existence of non-cow, the understanding that cow equals dewlap, etc. contradicts Apoha theory. This can be understood intuitively, for Apoha theory, which should be rooted in negation, to base its understanding on a positive existent like dewlap would clearly constitute a self-abandonment of the theory. Madhava and Dignāga. Historically, this very problem was pointed out by Madhava. Reconstructed from Janendra Buddhi's account, Dignāga, in a lost work, put forward the following argument. 5. Pervasion relation: if the cognition Y arises in the world from observing X, then Y is nothing other than X. Illustration: the cognition cow arises from observing dewlap, etc. Therefore, a cow is nothing other than dewlap, etc. Application: now, an entity is understood by observing the non-existence of other entities. Conclusion: therefore, an entity is nothing other than the non-existence of other entities. As an illustration of the general pervasion formula, if the cognition Y arises from observing X, then Y is nothing other than X. The specific example given is that since the cognition of cow arises from observing dewlap, etc., a cow is nothing other than dewlap, etc. When this is applied to Apoha theory, since an entity, e.g., a cow, is understood by observing the non-existence of other entities, e.g., the non-existence of non-cow, the conclusion is that an entity, e.g., a cow, is nothing other than the non-existence of other entities, e.g., the non-existence of non-cow. Illustration: cow equals dewlap, etc. Conclusion: cow equals non-existence of non-cow. Dignāga's intention appears to have been to appeal to common understanding for his Apoha theory. The problem lies in the illustration provided here. Dignāga likely intended this illustration to be merely a presentation of something generally accepted in the world. However, the Skaya scholar Madhava seized upon this. Madhava argued that an illustration, by its very nature, must also hold true for the Apoha theorist. From the perspective of debate, Veda, this is a perfectly valid claim. Yet, does a cow is nothing other than dewlap, etc. hold true in Apoha theory? As we have seen, the fundamental principle of Apoha theory is that a cow is nothing other than the non-existence of non-cow. These two views, cow equals dewlap, etc. and cow equals non-existence of non-cow, are incompatible. Therefore, Madhava pointed out that for the Apoha theorist, this illustration contradicts their own doctrine. 6. Regarding this, the Skaya scholar stated a counter-argument: if the cognition of a cow, Gapratyaya, arises based on the observation of dewlap, sasnadina, etc., then what was stated, the cognition of an entity, Atmantar arises based on the observation of the non-existence of other entities, Atmantarabhavadarsanat, is illogical. That is to say, if one accepts that all cognitions are caused by the observation of the non-existence of other entities, then how could the cognition of a cow be based on dewlap, etc.? This is precisely the same core issue that Tanazawa highlighted. Tanazawa's point is that in Apoha theory, one cannot begin with first there was dewlap, etc. As Apoha theory states that the understanding of cow is based on the exclusion of non-cow, basing it on the observation of dewlap, etc., fundamentally contradicts Apoha theory. Madhava made this exact same point, that the illustration contradicts the Apoha theory's own doctrine. Dignāga responded to Madhava's critique in PS v 41. He stated that this illustration was merely made by provisionally accepting, abhyopagamya, the Skaya view. Janendra Buddhi summarizes this in PS as follows: 7. That is to say, for you, Skaya, a collection of dewlap, sasnadasamaha, itself is a cow. Therefore, having provisionally acknowledged that, this illustration was stated, even though it contradicts the Apoha theorist's own doctrine. For the Skaya scholar, a cow is understood by observing dewlap, etc., and therefore, a cow is nothing other than dewlap, etc. Dignāga stated that by provisionally accepting this worldly understanding, similarly for the Apoha theorist, an entity is understood by observing the non-existence of other entities, and therefore, an entity is nothing other than the non-existence of other entities. Dignāga's fundamental view is also evident in his own statement. 8. How could someone who accepts the cognition of a cow, Gapratyaya, as having receded from non-cows, Aganivta say that it, the cognition of a cow, is caused by the observation of dewlap, Stidaran and Amida? The idea that the cognition of a cow is based on observing dewlap is the Skaya view, not the Apoha theorists. The Apoha theorists' view is that the cognition of a cow is based on observing the non-existence of non-cow, and that a cow is nothing other than the non-existence of non-cow. Following the same logic, according to Apoha theory, the cognition of dewlap should be based on observing the non-existence of non-dewlap, and dewlap should be nothing other than the non-existence of non-dewlap. As a result, since the objects of exclusion for cow and dewlap are different, they cannot be identical. Their respective cognitions will have different contents. Cow, non-existence of non-cow, is not equal to dewlap, non-existence of non-dewlap. Indeed, Dignāga states in PSV 41d, Binapoyas 2t emitha, but they, cow and dewlap, have mutually different objects of exclusion. Naturally, the cognition of a cow cannot be based on observing dewlap, etc. The objects of exclusion for cow and dewlap are different. Janendra Buddhi summarizes this as follows: 9. Since the object of exclusion is thus different, the cognition of dewlap, snipradhyaya, is understood by excluding non-dewlap, asasnadaya pohina, in the case of dewlap, etc. The cognition of a cow, gapratyaya, is understood by cutting off non-cow, agavya vakadina, in the case of a cow. And similarly, in the present case, the understanding of an entity, atmantar pratyaya, arises only from observing the non-existence of other entities, at mantarabhavadarsanad. In Apoha theory, the view that the understanding of an entity is based on observing the non-existence of other entities is consistent. Therefore, there is no contradiction with Buddhist own doctrine as Madhava claimed. Cognition of dulap, etc. Observing the non-existence of non-dulap, etc. Cognition of cow observing the non-existence of non-cow. Understanding of an entity observing the non-existence of other entities. First cognition and beginninglessness, anaditva. A natural question that arises from the Apoha theory as described above is, upon what, then, is the exclusion of non-cow ultimately based? A similar question was indeed posed by Madhava. If the cognition of X is based on the cognition of the non-existence of non-X, then cognition would always require a preceding cognition. This would mean that Apoha theory could not explain the first cognition, adiapratia, in the cycle of transmigration, sasra, which by definition cannot have a preceding cognition. 10. Dignāga responds to this in PSV 43a by grounding the chain of cognitions in the beginninglessness, anaditva, of worldly causality, even acknowledging it as desirable, isidir anaditvat. For Dignāga, it was natural that worldly understanding was a foundationless one, lacking a positive ultimate ground. It was not something that could be grounded in dulap, as the Skaya theory suggests. This discussion of the first cognition further reaffirms that for Dignāga, dulap could not be the ultimate ground. Conclusion. From the foregoing, it is clear that the view the understanding of a cow arises based on observing dulap, etc. belongs to the Skaya school, and Dignāga cited it as an illustration merely by provisionally acknowledging it. The core tenet of Apoha theory, however, remains that the understanding of a cow is based on observing the non-existence of non-cow, and the understanding of an entity is based on observing the non-existence of other entities. Tanazawa's critique, that an Apoha understanding which presents dulap as the basis for excluding non-cows would imply first there was dulap, etc., is historically echoed in Madhava's critique. By having acknowledged it, the illustration, one has oneself declared the abandonment of what was accepted, because the illustration involves abandoning one's own position. 11. Dignāga, in turn, clarified his own position in response to this: there is no abandonment of his own doctrine. The stance of Apoha theory is consistently the understanding of an entity is based on observing the non-existence of other entities. His position is that a general form, samanyarapam, does not arise without relying on the exclusion of other objects, arthatargvanarapaka nabhati. 12. The understanding of cow cannot be ultimately grounded in the positive existence of dulap, etc. Judged by Dignāga's own doctrine, the Apoha interpretations of Hattori and Akamatsu are, regrettably, inappropriate.